Good afternoon. Welcome. We're glad you've been able to join us this afternoon for this conversation on navigating the post-election healthcare landscape. My name is Matt Brubaker, and I'm the CEO of FMG Leading. We're an advisory firm focused on the organizations and people who make the healthcare system work, and this is a topic that's been on all of our minds for months. So I'm delighted to welcome our guests here today, a group of folks we know well and who have spent their careers thinking about what is happening in the healthcare ecosystem, where opportunities for growth and refinement can happen, and are prepared today, I think, for a fascinating conversation about some of the topics that are just now coming into focus. We also hope to be able to engage with questions from our audience. You'll see on your screen an opportunity to share those questions, which we'll get to in the bottom half of the hour. But now, as we get started, I'd love to invite my panelists to introduce themselves to the rest of us using this question as a prompt, and that is the following. Elections always capture the public's attention. You each have very unique roles and experiences, and I'd love for you to be able to tell our audience about what's captured your attention and why, given the unique work that you do in the healthcare industry. And we'll start with our friend Dan Polsky.
First, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So my name's Dan Polsky. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome. I'm a professor of in both the School of Public Health, Bloomberg School of Public Health, but also the Carey Business School. I have primary appointments in two different schools. I train the next generation of health leaders in business and public health. And I spend my time as a researcher informing healthcare policy on coverage, delivery, payment, and access. But mostly I'm a researcher, and I think about the role of evidence in driving healthcare policy. I spent a year at the Council of Economic Advisors as senior advisor on health issues, and I did just that. And so what I think about in terms of what drives health policy is what is the role of evidence, and how can evidence inform and drive policy? So that's what I've been paying attention to, and normally that seems like a pretty standard issue concern that actually doesn't raise much concern. But I think with the introduction of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as part of the landscape of healthcare in this new administration, with some of the rhetoric that seems to go against a lot of the standards of evidence that have driven health policy for a generation or two, that has gained a lot of attention, particularly in my seat at the School of Public Health. And so, but I'll stop there, and it's great to be here, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Dan. On to you, Curtis.
TS Health Partners, Winrose Health Investors, and Elements Health Investors. So engaged in both investment banking through MTS, which is the largest independent investment bank focused exclusively on healthcare, and Winrose, which I originally founded, and now Elements are private equity firms focused on investing in healthcare companies that either provide more cost-effective healthcare or enable more cost-effective healthcare to be provided. When I think about the elections, it means change, and change for a deal guy is good, right? The more change, the more deals. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't winners and losers. Coming out of this, there'll be existing portfolio companies that will have to face some new issues coming out of this. But for the most part, I view it as an exciting time for more opportunities and more change, which should lead to more opportunities. But, a specific answer to your question, what do I look for at this stage? I'm trying to figure out who's going to be in what role. That's really going to tell us a lot about the direction that we're going. If RFK is made the head of HHS, I might feel different than other people being the head of HHS. Fortunately, what we're hearing out of Florida is there are, good, solid people that are well respected in our community being considered for top roles.
Thanks, Curtis. And finally, Sonia, to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Matt, for having me, and a pleasure to be here with you, Curtis and Dan as well. I am Sonia Millsom. I'm the CEO of Oxeon, and I've spent over 30 years in the healthcare ecosystem as an operator, a variety of organizations. For those who don't know Oxyon, our mission is to reimagine a healthcare system that everybody can trust. And our organization is a really unique combination of executive search, entrepreneurship, and investment. And when I think about what am I paying the most attention to, it really calls to mind a quote from Hubert Humphrey that talks about the measure of a society is how we treat those at the dawn and the dusk of their lives at the times when they are the most vulnerable. And that is really how I've been thinking about the things that I've been paying attention to from the election perspective. They're really along the roles of reproductive rights. We know, obviously, that we saw the reversal of Roe versus Wade previously, and now thinking about what that looks like from an access perspective for individuals across the entire country. We saw abortion on the ballot in 10 states, and 7 of them actually withheld abortion rights during that time period. But really, it also has an impact as you think about Medicaid, because almost 50% of births take place in Medicaid. The other place that I'm really interested in thinking about is really around women's health. For those of us, I'll date myself a little bit. We actually first brought women to clinical trials in 1993, which is when I graduated from college. So we have a lot of work to do in the area of data and science, which you talked about, Dan, in terms of evidence and what that looks like. And we knew that under the Biden administration, there was a considerable amount of spending that was put there, both from the Women's Health Research as well as through ARPA from Joe Biden as well. And so will those things continue? And then lastly is really on the dusk of life, when you think about Medicare Advantage and what we see as we think about the continuity of that program for seniors, which has almost 50% of Medicare beneficiaries in it today, and has really had a number of issues and constraints over the last 4 years under the administration, when we saw a really large increase in reimbursement and then really have been an over-rotation on reduction in costs and what that looks like for many of these insurance companies that we're seeing in the ecosystem as well. So those are the things that I'm paying attention to. It's a lot of change in the system, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Well, thank you to each of you. And again, as you can now see, there's a very unique set of perspectives reflected on our panel here today. Knowing that our client base and the folks I spend most of my time with are either folks who are running healthcare companies or investing in healthcare companies, there's a bias in the questions I'm bringing to today around what are the implications, right? If I'm trying to grow a business, I'm trying to provide greater access to care, or trying to find ways to make the healthcare dollar go further, what can I expect in the coming weeks, months, and years? And so the first question for our panel is, what do you expect will change most significantly, and what might not change at all? New regulations, changing reimbursement rates and structures. What do you anticipate on the block for significant change in the next phase? And I'll go to you first, Curtis.
I don't see a risk of a wholesale change in the system. There's not things being proposed like there might have been in other elections for a single payer system, where we're going to basically say, from a political point of view, we're going to change how we pay for and deliver healthcare in some fashion. I don't see that. The last Trump administration, healthcare was not a big priority in that regard, other than the cost of it, if you will, and kind of political football of saying the ACA doesn't work. So I don't see that much of a risk of a wholesale change. That said, the changes will be significant in certain areas, in that, I think it starts with what the government will fund, right? Will they be more sensitive and careful about what they spend, and how does that reflect through the system? I agree that I don't think MA is going away. I think it's pretty well insulated. It tends to go back and forth. I'm never sure whether or not the Democrats like it most and the Republicans the least, and then it switches, because I think it's switched back and forth 4 or 5 times about who likes the program and who doesn't. So I think right now the Republicans like the program, the Democrats don't. So I think that should be okay for a while until somebody gets into the CMS seat, changes things around. We don't think that will happen per se, but I don't see that as a risk. I do see reimbursement rates as a risk, and how much people are paid because of more fiscal discipline. And I think this will particularly come to, you see it in the Medicaid space, right? When you think about how the federal government will be, funding the states for their Medicaid program, there are going to be some states that are going to have real difficulties, and that they're not equipped to be able to take cuts with respect to that, as well as for the players that are providing care into that space, or the payers. a cutback in eligibility, either with work standards, things like that. So I think you'll see a lot of the energy and activity that could be disconcerting to a lot of business models that we deal with will probably first and foremost have direct impact on Medicaid. And then finally, I think the other change is the FTC. That has been a real impediment. The FTC has been a real impediment to appropriate consolidation. Reality is you can't lower cost, which you do through getting some degree of scale, if you also believe you can't have any consolidation. So I think that it's incongruous what the policy has been, and that should clear up, and FTC should not be about, being able to publicly say we want to change how our commerce is conducted in this country. It'll go back to looking at what's appropriate, what's not appropriate.
Curious what the rest of the panel would add to that. What do you see coming? What's likely to change? What may stay the same for a while?
I can jump in. Yeah, I think the other piece that I would add on to what Curtis said is really around the ACA. And I think there was such you couldn't repeal it completely at this point, I think, because people are very like it a lot, and it would be really politically risky in order to do that. That said, I think there's specific areas of the ACA and policies, as well as loosening some of the market conditions and for the insurance companies that you could see come to bear, which we've seen part of some of what Vance has said already in terms of what he advocates for. So I think that's the other place that you'll see, which obviously can have implications on the number of people who are insured, which has implications on other areas of the economy as well. So I think that's one other place to look at. And then the one place I think that's the same, which actually both parties have a lot of consistency on, is around pharmacy pricing and reimbursements. What do we see there? So will they go further than the Biden administration already has? It's something that the Trump administration has looked at in the past. And I think that is another place where we will see some activity and see it quickly.
I don't know too much to that. Those were great answers. I'm thinking of, payers, providers, producers, and populations. I think for payers, for coverage, the end of the ACA subsidies were expanded for 5 years or so. That ends in 2025. The odds of that being continued, that led to an increase in the number covered under the marketplace from about 12 million to 20 million. It probably won't be continued, to be my guess. That won't be a popular decision. And so I could imagine that market shrinking. So whether you're a payer or provider that has a lot of exposure in that market, that's a risk. For Medicare Advantage, I think there's some of the uncertainty around, very recently around star ratings. I think there's some view that will be rolled back, and some of the stiffer regulations will be harder to enforce, and so less regulatory scrutiny, I think, will do well for the large payers in the MA space. And then, as Curtis mentioned, in the Medicaid space, I think there's some longer term risks of kind of reducing that program. On the provider side, which I might talk about a little later, I don't see too many large changes. That probably more on the kind of workforce side of things, which is also something we might talk a little bit more about, but it's just not an area of major attention for the administration. And I would say the same thing for providers. I think there's a lot of noise around drug costs, but I think on the whole, there's be more a kind of welcoming opportunity for investment in the producer space around pharmaceuticals and some more opportunity than if there was a different administration there. And for patients, I think that's where the biggest potential changes are. I think healthcare is almost a casualty of some of the attention to what's happening around immigration and abortion that will certainly affect women's health of immigrants and other populations that got a lot more attention during the previous administration.
Well, thanks. That's a seedbed of topics we could explore. One that has come up a few times already is private equity, certainly in the last administration, at least by certain segments of government. We were hearing more and more about measures to try to restrict or restrain private equity's role in the healthcare system. I'm curious what you see or anticipate over the next several years in terms of the question of the role of private equity. And Sonia, we'll go to you first.
Sure. I mean, I think private equity, like everything, you see different aspects of the segment, right? And you see those investors that are thoughtful and considerate and are really thinking about really how do we create sustainability in our system that allows for both providers and patients to have a system that's financially stable as well as clinically effective for the long term. And then you do see some bad actors that are there that are looking for just short-term financial gain. And I think we know that there's a reason that there's a spotlight here. It's really about the $29 billion in deal value that took place in healthcare in 2023. And it's $4.5 trillion of expenditure. So making sure that there's some spotlight on both of those components, I think is actually a good thing, and making sure that we're doing the right thing for the system. But we also need to know that the reality of the way that healthcare operates today is the days of the little black bag of the doctor are gone. And we need to have a way that we can create appropriate scale across different geographies that allows for some efficiency and consistency, frankly, in quality, which I think private equity is able to do. And I think the reality is also that we have a really broken system, and we need to have some private dollars that go into that system in order to allow for innovation. And whether it's through venture capital or private equity, we need to have those dollars that come to bear. And if we don't have that, we're not going to see any changes. And so the reality is having something that's in the middle and having it appropriately reviewed and having some spotlight on it so that bad things don't happen, I think is the right way to think about it.
Thanks to me. I wonder what others would add to that.
When I think I agree with Sonia on so much of what she said. I focus on it. I do believe that capital can drive change for the better. But just because there are a few bad actors doesn't mean that the whole system should be thought of differently. But unfortunately, the way the political world works, what was happening with Steward Health became, a poster child for abuse. I never thought that company was a very good company, but I didn't know they were such crooks. But, now everybody wants to generalize that to anything that private equity has anything to do with, which obviously I don't think is right. And I personally take some exception to it because we invest a tremendous amount of time, energy, and money into quality, into systems to preserve and make sure that we provide quality. That just gets thrown out the window when someone just says you're in private equity and investing in healthcare, that you must not be that way. You must be more like the bad guys which are just a tiny percentage of what the system is about.
I think I was on mute before, but I'll just add that in response to Curtis, I don't think that the new political environment is going to, the scrutiny on private equity during the Biden administration didn't really result in much policy change. So the policies won't get loosened because there weren't restricted in the private equity space, as far as I can tell. It was really scrutiny that was from researchers or just reporting on the bad actors, and the extent that I don't see the political environment changing that dialogue on people raising concerns in Model A and Model B. Certainly, there might be Model C and Model D that are doing great things, and I would give Curtis that those often don't get the same press coverage as the bad actors.
Yeah, indeed. Those are well said. And it brings to mind the next question, which gets at evolving healthcare delivery models. One of the ways in which private equity has really accelerated healthcare transformation is finding novel ways in bringing both capital and technology and management and scale to beginning to change and shift delivery models. I'm curious what you all are thinking about models that might evolve in the next phase, and what changes, if any, or what innovations leaders ought to be prioritizing as you think about delivery models in the next phase. And Dan, this one comes to you first.
Sure. When I think of what has spurred so much innovation in delivery models, I think of changes in value-based payment models that come from CMS and from government policy. That's never been a political hot potato, and I see that continuing with new models. I imagine CMMI might get a harder look than it has in terms of its overall value, but I see that kind of innovative environment continuing. The other thing that there was a lot of innovation that happened from crisis, from COVID in the past 4 years, and very dramatic changes in adoption of telehealth models. And so a lot of the innovation that happened from crisis, so hopefully we won't have another one. But I don't see the tenor of the movements that we've seen in the past few years changing very much. I think the attention and innovation on low-income populations and questions of addressing equity, which I think got a lot of energy in the past administration, might lose a little of its steam going forward. But otherwise, I don't see too many changes.
Thanks. Others, what would you add?
Bitcoin for physician reimbursement.
All day long.
I'm kidding. Just really piggybacking on what Dan said. Prior to my role at Oxeon, I'm part of the work that I've done was I was the chief growth officer at Iora, so really helped see that value-based care initiative on primary care firsthand and how those models can have an impact. And it was really, I see those, I know in the near term, it's been difficult to do that, both between the regulatory environment, but also just the reality of the scale that's needed and the infrastructure that's needed to make those models work, which are a long-term play, not a short-term play. And so I think I'm still on long-term bearish on that. We're starting to see, bullish on that. We're seeing some of it where it has been bearish, but the long-term I see as bullish. And we're seeing more of these advanced models take place also in specialty care. You're starting to see more in oncology and cardiology, and I think you'll start to see more of those. And again, it's where we're seeing investment opportunities there to have actually, again, a focus on sustainability and quality and more consistent outcomes over time and leveraging data in a really unique way. And I'd be remiss without talking about AI. I think that is a place and an opportunity for us to actually drive some efficiencies within the system, both from a back office perspective, but then also really thinking about talking about providers and allowing them to operate at the top of the license. So if you start to look at these AI scribes and some of the other innovations that have taken place that are just really helping people spend more time on the delivery of care versus on the administration of care and on the technicalities of payment, which I think is where we have a tremendous amount of opportunity. We're already seeing some of that come into the infrastructure. I think we'll see more of this administration for sure.
I agree. I think about, changes in the models, delivery models, et cetera. It's just a continuation of what we've been going on through for a long time and continue doing, which is the fundamental shift in how our healthcare system works, to move from a system in which consumers didn't pay for their healthcare and the providers of healthcare got paid for doing more healthcare. So we had a complete lack of alignment historically, just as an accident of history, of how our system was created, which we've been working at for 30 or 40 years of trying to move away from in one way or another. We laugh about the term value-based care because we've been doing delegated risk models or sharing of risk for 35 years. Now it's called value-based care, but it really is just an example of the continuing evolution of really creating economic models that tie outcomes into what's done to create those outcomes and have aligned participants in the system. And I think that will continue in a pretty significant way, given who the people that will be coming into the administration who are big believers in those type of shifts. So I'm kind of encouraged about what we can see coming out of this and could see a lot of really interesting and new reimbursement models to help do that.
There's great stuff in there. And Sonia, you mentioned AI, and we could debate perhaps whether it's a function of the next administration or it's just a function of maturing technology over the next 4 years. But there's no question AI is part of what we'll be looking at. And I'm curious if the others would want to weigh in on that. What are your thoughts on the role of AI in healthcare delivery over the next several years? What do we expect to see, maybe from an investor's perspective, and even, Dan, as you think about it at a macro level, what might we be seeing differently as we look back 4 years from now?
I'll start this one. The bottom line is I have no idea, but I'll give it a shot. I'm an academic. I have no problem just talking. There AI for like backroom operations in a healthcare delivery system, I think, is a much easier to implement, and we've seen a lot more energy around there, like the AI scribes, versus something that is kind of front and center as a kind of de facto device or diagnosing algorithm. There has been work at the FDA to approve these algorithms. I think that the structure of, say, the FDA and the regulatory structure of the FDA allows for markets in pharmaceutical products, in devices, because they've been approved by this regulatory structure that has sufficient trust among consumers to create a marketplace for these private products. There's a lot that needs to happen in AI and these AI diagnostics to develop that same level of trust for a market for AI products that are very much at the interface of healthcare delivery, to have a well-functioning marketplace. And so where it comes down to this kind of evolving political environment is the degree to which regulations will be embraced as an important tool to accelerate regulation to create well-functioning markets for AI, where there's just still remains a lot of uncertainty. So that remains to be seen how that plays out. But I guess it's a pitch for leaning into cooperation between the private sector and the public sector to create an opportunity for these new, for the possibility and the potential for AI to be at the interface of healthcare delivery.
Thanks, Ted. Anything you'd add from the investor banker's perspective, Curtis?
I haven't seen a deck lately in the last year and a half that didn't have AI in it 6,200 times. It's AI then. It's like, so I think that it's assumed to get a 20% pickup in your valuation if you can somehow incorporate AI into your presentation. But I think it's a tool, not an answer. And that, people have to think about what it is that you're looking to do and how can AI influence it, make it more cost effective, et cetera, as opposed to being the answer unto itself. Remember when smaller scale social determinants of health became, when the term first came out, and everybody was scrambling for ways to invest in it, where our attitude towards it is, no, that's how we should operate our businesses around those, and be, looking to take advantage of what you learn from it. But in and of itself, it wasn't a business.
It's good. There's a lot to chew on in that. We talked in the early questions about the role of the Federal Trade Commission. I'm curious, as you think about the next 4 years, it was clear that under the previous administration, the administrator there was focused on influencing the nature of strategic M&A that obviously had an impact on healthcare companies' ability to grow and consolidate. I'm curious for our panelists' comments on where do you see that going and where, loosening, but where do you see consolidation starting to happen quickly as the loosening happens?
We've never had, that I could recall in my career, an activist FTC where there was a goal of changing the entire mechanism and approach and thinking about consolidation. So we've had that, and it didn't go very well. It slowed things down and made things more expensive. A lot of legal cases, but companies still pursued it. And most of the time they were able to go through with it by engaging in litigation with the FTC. I think, going forward, we're just going to be eliminating that concept of using regulatory powers within the FTC to change the economics of consolidation and the underlying economics of our, you could say, of a lot of parts of our country. So I think when you take away that political overlay of trying to make change, we're back and should be back with professionals doing their job professionally, which is to determine what makes sense to consolidate or if it creates unfair competition. Just because you don't like the way something operates doesn't mean it's unfair competition. Just because you're successful doesn't mean that you're an unfair competitor, right? It's those type of things that I think we're going to get away from and focus on the reality of how to, look at consolidation in an appropriate manner.
Dan, Sonia, would you add anything to that one?
Even if the effect was that ultimately M&A might go through a lot of cost, it did put a kind of a coolant on seeking M&A activity, and so I could see that certainly accelerating in the new administration. And the impact of, the economics shows that, a consolidation and less competition in certain markets can lead to increased prices, less competition on a quality domain as well. And so, it could have some ultimate impact on how, what our healthcare delivery system looks like in terms of how many actors are participating, whether it's on the provider end or the insurer end. And in some markets, insurers have more power than providers, and in other markets, it's the other way around. But I definitely see that power dynamic, playing out more actively going forward.
Yeah, Matt, I think the only other thing I would add is just around the issues around non-compete. We see these on the executive search side of things. And I think that was the other place where the FTC was taking a pretty pro-employee ruling stance of saying, non-competes are banned for everything. And that was obviously blocked in September 2024. And I suspect that they would, if you think of a pro-business ruling, it is having those non-competes in place. And again, there's probably some balance or middle ground of what those should be to allow people to have some flexibility, but also, again, to maintain trade secrets and competitive natures of these organizations that are competing with each other. So I think it's the other area to be mindful of, and we'll continue to watch.
Oh, that's great. We're at the bottom of the hour, and some questions from our audience are starting to come in. I thought I'd introduce this one into the mix. There's been a lot of hype around value-based care over the past 5 to 10 years, even though we haven't yet seen many tangible, meaningful wins. It continues to be of interest to investors. Do you foresee that changing over the coming years?
I'll take a shot, because I think I talked about value-based care. I don't agree with part of the question that there haven't been many tangible, meaningful wins. I think there have been a lot, a real lot of them. But, it's a question of what you define value-based care at. Is it the full delegation? Is it partial delegation? Is it partial sharing of risk? There's tons of models to be able to do value-based care, which in my view is just creating more alignment between the payers and the providers and the consumers. So, you go back into the managed care movement in MA, right? California started managed care movement by basically being administrative and marketing organizations and delegating the care to big physician groups. They were doing that for years. Then MA happened, and that's what that model became out in California. That is value-based care. Its earliest and its purest form, if you will. But there's tons of other models that have taken place since that time. So I think there have been very tangible, meaningful wins.
And I'll just add that I agree. I think there have been meaningful changes for sure. And I don't see anyone saying less value-based care. If anything, more. But value-based care has added an element of complexity in our healthcare delivery system, and smaller providers seek larger partners. And if providers are holding risk, they want to spread that risk. And I think there have been some consequences of value-based care. I know in the research environment, there's a lot of my researcher friends and colleagues, and probably myself included, that is taking a closer look at the corporatization of healthcare delivery. And I see that as kind of a consequence, somewhat, one of the consequences of value-based care. So while there's no, I think, pushback against value-based care as an important movement, I think some of the ways that the healthcare environment has responded to the new incentives to develop these new models, I do see some added attention to whether that's a version of healthcare delivery that is beneficial to society. And so maybe that's over the long term, there'll be some attention, greater attention to that, and maybe some pulling back. But in the short term, the next 5 years or so, I think it's full steam ahead.
I would agree. And again, I have some bias from my own experience of actually seeing these care delivery models work. They take a long time. They're hard to change the behavior that has been ingrained with providers and payers and patients, quite frankly, both from the consumerism point that Curtis made earlier. And you do see them work. And I think you also see them when they're highly localized and well-funded and doing what needs to get done. You actually see huge impact, not just on the actual cost of care, but on the community at large. And so I am very supportive of that. And we need to be thoughtful and mindful of how we put those models together in order to create the sustainability for them. But I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to do that and to do it well.
An example of where it worked, is it just occurred to me, is when Medicaid managed care first started, right? So if you think about Medicaid was a fee-for-service business, and then you went into managed care, the states were contracting with managed care players. That's a shift to value-based care, if you will. But some of the statistics were unbelievable in terms of just attacking prenatal care for Medicaid enrollee, mothers-to-be, and stopping the number of preemies that took place beforehand significantly changed the entire cost of the Medicaid program at its outset. So I think that's a perfect example of it. And there are other opportunities, maybe not to that scale so quickly, because that was the fastest I think I've ever seen it. But there are tons of those opportunities. The thing about healthcare is there are little arbitrages everywhere, where if you can close that arbitrage, you're going to improve quality and take costs out of the system.
And just in terms of evidence, just to pile on here on the value of value-based care is, if you look intervention by intervention, I mean, they're hard to implement, but also they work best when they're really focused. But when you zoom out at the 30,000-foot level, healthcare cost growth has slowed in surprising ways for a country in the last 5 years. And there's compelling evidence that is linking this slowing to an overall change in attitude and acceleration of value-based care models. And so even if on any single intervention, it seems like a small percentage, it adds up and it's changed attitudes across the delivery system that shows up in our national accounting of healthcare expenditure.
Good point.
Yeah, that's great discussion. There's a couple more from the audience. One of them is, with Cigna backing away from the Humana deal, how much of an appetite do you think there will be during the next administration for sort of mega M&A deals to occur? So not beyond the question of private equity's role, big consolidations. Any thoughts or perspectives on that from our panel?
I think it goes back to a more normalized definition of what anti-competitiveness means. So if we get that type of a framework, then I think we will see big deals across the landscape, particularly with what's happened with, the MA program and delegated risk model to the providers that provide into it. One of the answers has got to be consolidation by those players, given how they've struggled over the last couple of years with changes in the program.
Yeah, I guess to me, it's the question of, is it consolidation across like multiple MA plans coming together? Is it more of this vertical integration, that you saw CVS, to go down the path on and what that looks like? And so again, integrating those care delivery systems within plans, I think, is an opportunity for the future as well. And, you see it shift back and forth over time, but I think it'll probably, we need to continue to see some of that integration in order for the system to work well versus having payers and provider at odds together.
I don't have much to add to this, but I agree.
Good. Another good question. Two more from the audience here. One is, should we expect changes to hospital health system regulatory oversight, especially regarding standards and regulations governed by entities like CMS and the Joint Commission? Do you expect any immediate or medium-term changes there in terms of regulatory oversight?
I think it's a wait and see. We'll see who. That's a hard one to predict. Yeah, they're going to prioritize. Whoever comes in and runs CMS, there are things they're going to go after, and some things will keep chugging along. This might be one of those things that chug along, but I think it's a wait and see.
Yeah, it depends on who gets appointed.
Yeah, we're in wait and see mode on that one. And then last audience question here for a minute. What do you think the range of impact will be with the introduction of RFK Jr.? It came up earlier in our tee up as a guy who can potentially go wild on all things health. So there's some hype around it, and then there's some question marks around it. What are your points of view?
I mean, it's hard to know for sure. I think exactly what that looks like. I mean, I will say it's been interesting to see the pieces around like preservatives in food and just the reality of some of the impact that does have on society. And, I'll say as a mom, I'm like that. I think that'd be great to have, real spotlight on what that looks like and being really thoughtful about our food supply, because it has a huge impact on health and long-term longevity within our society. We know and see that. So I think that's an interesting thing to watch, but what exactly he'll do and where are the places he goes wild to be determined.
Is he going to be the head of HHS or is he going to be a marginalized advisor? We have no idea yet.
One thing that I've thought about just to try to think about what impact, how difficult it is to really disrupt the healthcare sector. So take vaccines. Someone comes in that is, say, down on vaccines in an administration that's favorable to to larger industries and a lot of the income that large manufacturers of vaccines make. Vaccines are important, and they don't want to see a decline in demand for their products, and their voice will be heard too. So I think the same thing could be said in the food industry and other industries that might be disrupted by some of the thinking that we've heard in the rhetoric from this actor. So I think that rhetoric is one thing, and wanting to make large wholesale changes is different than actually executing on that. And so I don't expect major changes. I think the largest challenge will be just in the rhetoric and the degree to which the rhetoric is supported by evidence. And so that's something that I'm most paying attention to there.
Great. These are good questions. Thank you. We'll probably have room for a few more. I'm going to go back to one we've prepared in advance, which is around the role of healthcare staffing and industry staffing shortages in particular. It's been a topic of conversation that is even in some ways apolitical, but I'm curious, based on what you see coming in the next 4 years, how does the role of staffing play in the conversations we'll be having? And I'll come to you first, Sonia.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to think about, and just for the context, right? We're looking at a physician shortage of almost 65,000 physicians by the end of this year, over 300,000 registered nurses shortage at the end of this year, and 60% of clinicians say that they want a different job. And so if you put those things in context, you have to really think about what is the supply that we have in our arena and what do we do about that? And so I think the reality is that there's no short-term fix here. We talked a little bit about technology and other things that can help extend and really think again, I think, frankly, about the workflow of how we do care delivery and also the patient interactions and what that looks like. I think the longer point is that we actually need to have a change in our education system that allows for a different way for us to bring providers into the system and educate them, and to think more about alternative providers or community health workers or other parts of the ecosystem that can help play a role in actually bringing care delivery into particularly areas that are shortages. 50% of all counties do not have an OBGYN. We see this particularly in the rural areas as well. So we need to really think about sustainable solutions there. I think the other thing to think about is just immigration. My father came here 53 years ago as a physician and from India, and practiced in this country. And as you start to think about the issues around immigration, and we know that 25% of the physician workforce are immigrants that are in graduate school that have come here. So how do we think about that as we think about the context of immigration, as well as the impact on staffing within the healthcare system? I think there's a really big connection there that we need to think about as particularly with the Trump administration and the views that they put forward and what that looks like.
And I'm glad you raised that about immigration, Sonia, because I think this subject has to take us to that discussion, because there are so many opportunities to ease the shortages, to bring in very well-trained, very capable people, if we can allow it to happen. So I think that's going to be a key part. And as well as from a regulatory point of view, allowing less educated, degreed, if you will, however you want to call it, to do more in the system more cost effectively.
I don't have much to add. Yeah, on the macro side, the policies of this new administration seem expansionary, so there'll be greater, job opportunities. We have low level of unemployment. There'll be less people coming and less immigrants, and higher tariffs, so greater production here. So, the staffing issues are going to really intensify if any of those statements around future policies actually get implemented.
There are two questions from the audience that might merge. They're sort of just policy questions in general, and it's asking you, based on your perspective, to look into your proverbial crystal ball. One of them is PBM and pharma services in a Trump administration. What, if anything, do you foresee based on what you know from the last 4 years of the Trump administration that might be coming our way?
I mean, we don't know for sure, but what I touched on before again is this component of transparency and price. There has been this concept of like we pay much more for pharmaceuticals than other people in other countries do, and so how do we create some perspective on that and what that looks like? Obviously, that has impact on research and innovation around it as well, and so it's a balancing act. But I would not be surprised if we see more impact there and really trying to create more some pricing controls as well as transparency on pricing around PBMs and pharmacy.
Great.
Yeah, if we had a pharma expert on our panel, we might have more there. But I agree completely with what's been said.
Well, and it's rare that you point out, Sonia, that it's one that the two candidates, at least based on what we know in this election, more or less held common ground on. Last crystal ball question for you is around tariffs. Recognizing in a relatively vague way, the Trump administration has talked about tariffs as a tool. How do you anticipate that impacting the U.S. healthcare industry, if at all?
I don't think we import that much, right? From a
Devices.
What we get from right, or India, we don't. We do get some, but I don't think my initial reaction to it is not enough of it to be tariff that would significantly change the cost structure, and that there are other alternatives domestically to make the things that might get tariffed.
Yeah, I think the weakness is in the supply chain for pharmaceuticals, and there could be disruptions in some of the ingredients that come from countries that, there might be leverage there, right? They get a tariff on one thing and they withhold ingredients on another thing. There's a real vulnerability in the U.S. supply chain for important pharmaceutical products that people in our society are depend on for sustaining their health. And so while it might not be a macro thing in the healthcare delivery system, it could be some noises around supply chain.
Yeah, my mind goes to technology and device. And I'm not the expert there, but when I start to think about, what are the types of things that we import that help support the development of those things is what I think about. We just think about robotic surgery, all of those other components there. But again, I'm not the one to have the most educated perspective here in details.
Good context now.
But those innovations for new devices tend to come from the U.S. and made here, oftentimes initially. But I'm not a device expert either.
So there's another question from our audience. If each of you had the opportunity to get the administration's ear around one topic or theme that you think could meaningfully improve healthcare in this country, what would that one thing be? That's a great question, by the way. So your pet issue, the thing you would plant in someone's ear to say, pay attention to this with a clean slate, so to speak, of policy making in front of us, what would you be talking about?
I'll start. Behavioral health, access to behavioral health care providers, making behavioral health a priority for healthcare delivery and for access to care. I think it's a very difficult thing to address. I don't think that's a very controversial topic. And if we had to, move the needle on the health of our country, that's one place that I think there's a lot of room for movement.
I'd be focused on how to make, if we're not going to have wholesale changes, that's the thesis, how to make what we have work better. And it takes me back to the ACA and to the exchange members. How do we make that work better? One of the things that, because forget about what you think about politically about subsidies, et cetera, but the conception of the ACA originally was to get insurance more affordable to people that weren't buying it, to give them coverage. But I think we conflated the concept of health care and health insurance, that people believe that health insurance equals health care, when in fact it's an insurance product as opposed to the delivery of actual health care. So when you think about, how where the ACA has failed in my mind is it hasn't achieved any of the economic consequences or expectations in terms of what it would mean from a budgetary point of view, et cetera. And I think that has a lot to do with benefit design, that the benefits are often richer than what people want to buy, but they think they're buying healthcare rather than health insurance. And I'd love to see the ACA rebuilt along, with some products in it that people really will buy without having to require a subsidy, which would mean less essential benefits, but a lot more catastrophic coverage.
I go back to maternal health. 50% of our births take place in Medicaid. We have a lack of consistency in payment and care that takes place. And we know that the investments that are made at the very beginning of life and the first 3 years after have a huge impact on health outcomes, both for mom, baby, and family. And so the reality that we have consistency in the Medicare space in the dusk, but again, at that dawn of life, we do not have any consistency, and it has become less consistent and more variable. And we have the worst maternal health statistics of any, industrialized country in the world. And so if there's a place where we could be putting more time and attention and really think from a clean slate perspective, that's where I would put it on.
Great answers. So as I mentioned earlier, we spend on the FMG leading side, at least most of our time, and I spend most of my time engaging with CEOs who are responsible for navigating the growth and the maturing and the evolution of healthcare delivery companies, and with investors who are writing big checks and looking for ways to add value. Right? And I would say maybe it's a self-selection on our part, but we end up working with people who are universally committed to saying, how do we get more value out of every dollar that we're spending? I don't think anybody debates that we spend more, get less. I don't think anybody would think the use of the word crisis or broken is hyperbole. And so knowing that, at least from the FMG leading side of things, there's an audience of folks who are getting up every day saying, how do I do something about this? I'm going to do the hard work of leading and scaling and solving problems on behalf of the delivery system while I also create value. So your closing statement, if you will, from each of our three panelists is to think about what that person in those roles would hear from you based on your perspective. Talent person, an investor, a banker, an academic, someone who's thinking about the system. What advice would you give to the folks who are getting up every day running those organizations based on your unique perspective gained over decades in this industry?
I just finished my class this morning on foundations of the business of health, and there are often gaps between where you might be able to profit within the healthcare delivery system and where you can add the most value in terms of, generating the most health for society, making that dollar go further, as you said so nicely, Matt. That requires thinking, with a bigger picture than just, one solution. How can that solution drive value? And so, my perspective is always, don't just think of your actions as a single actor in a healthcare delivery system, but you have to think of how your product, your investment, your actions within the healthcare delivery system impact the other actors. How are payers going to react? How are providers going to react? How are the patients going to react when you come with your solution? I think there's so many opportunities in the healthcare space for technologists and for making a difference and for earning a nice paycheck. And so doing all that at the same time is difficult, but I think inspiring the students to think broadly, as you just said, Matt, like, how do we make it go further? If I really want to make a difference, and that's why I'm in healthcare. Everyone gets in healthcare for really an amazing story that they bring from their own experiences to really make a difference. And so I think with this new administration, there are new opportunities, but thinking about the big picture, about taking advantage of those new opportunities to drive value for not only your investors, but for society. I think it's a tremendous opportunity, as with any change.
Thanks, Dan. We'll come to you, Curtis.
I just go back to who pays for it and why. To look at things through that lens, it captures a lot. the payment side, the provider side, the consumer side, but who pays for it and why? Tells you the value of the products, value of the service, where it's valued from the payers. So I think that's just a lens by way to look at what we're talking about and continue to apply that type of an approach to understanding what the changes are taking place. Because as Dan says, there's so many of them, right? I mean, the beauty of healthcare is you can think about it as a microeconomic exercise every day on the ground to get to the macro. But it really is, at the end of the day, so many different microeconomic decisions, which all boil down to my mind is who's going to pay for it and why.
Well said. Thanks, Curtis. Sonia, you get the last word. What's your advice?
Yeah, I think it's all about the people, Matt. I think it's about making sure you've got the right people at all the tables, the executive leadership table, the boardroom table, and the cap table. And I think when you have that alignment of people in those places, and it's time for us to have some different people in those places, quite candidly, I think, and provide some perspective and different points of view, I think that's where you really have the ability to drive change. And so I'm optimistic that regardless of what happens, with the policy administration, that the healthcare ecosystem is resilient and that we have the opportunity to put the right people across all of those tables to drive a sustainable system for all of us for many generations to come.
Well said. Well, I want to recognize we've spent an hour here, and I'm clear that we could have a follow-on conversation or two. There's a lot of interesting topics, and we should come back in a year and talk about how accurate our predictions have been. I also want to say thanks to all of you who've been with us for this hour. Thanks for believing in and having passion about what happens in the system. We're grateful to have been part of this dialogue and wish you well for the rest of your day. Take care and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.